Faye Holcombe, at 71, after 40 years walking the fire trails of Pisgah National Forest and 39 years of marriage to Wallace Holcombe, had believed that two people who had built a life together would walk out of it the same way they walked in. She was wrong. The divorce had taken 18 months. By the time the gavel came down in the Watauga County courthouse, Wallace had taken the 4-bedroom on Faulkner Lane, the joint accounts at First Citizens, the Charleston timeshare, and the pension he had managed since 1987. Faye had walked out with a forest ranger's pension that paid the rent and a single box of her late mentor's papers. Inside that box was a tarnished brass key on a Forest Service lanyard and a hand-drawn map of Rich Mountain with one X marked at the summit. The map was in Cass Tweed's careful ranger's print. The note said only, "When you need it, see." But what Wallace Holcombe had never understood about his quiet wife's old mentor was that Cass had spent the last 30 years of his life quietly restoring a decommissioned 1932 fire watchtower on his own private 80 acres of Rich Mountain, a place Wallace had once called the worthless rock pile your ranger friend left you. What Wallace had never bothered to look up was the surveyed acreage, the deed history, or the conservation easement the state of North Carolina had been trying to negotiate for the last 3 years. If you've ever been left by a husband after 39 years and watched him walk out with the bank accounts, the pension, and the address you'd been writing on your tax forms for 4 decades, if you've stood with a single brass key in your palm and wondered whether anywhere in the world was still yours to walk into, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Faye Holcombe found at the top of that abandoned fire watchtower will make you believe that an old ranger leaves an inheritance only the right woman is ever meant to climb the stairs to find. Welcome to the last chapter. The 18 months of divorce proceedings had unfolded the way Wallace ran every transaction of his life, slowly, methodically, with 3 attorneys and a forensic accountant, whose hourly rate exceeded what Faye had earned in a week of her early ranger years. Wallace had filed in the spring, citing irreconcilable differences and an itemized inventory of marital property that ran to 47 pages. Faye had read it once, in the kitchen of the Faulkner Lane house, and then she had set it down on the counter beside the cold coffee and walked out into the small back garden where the dogwood was just beginning to show pink. She had stood there a long time, listening to a Carolina wren singing in the rhododendron, and she had understood that the man who had drawn up that inventory was not the man she had married in 1985. Or perhaps he had always been that man. Perhaps the difference was only that she had finally stopped pretending not to see him. Wallace's lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Dunn, who wore navy suits and pearl earrings and spoke in the soft, professional voice of someone who had broken many marriages on behalf of many clients. She had explained, in a conference room overlooking King Street, that Wallace was prepared to be reasonable about the household contents and reasonable about the silver and reasonable about the frame photographs from the Outer Banks trips, and reasonable, she said, about almost everything except the structural assets. The structural assets, Patricia Dunn had explained, were the house, the joint accounts, the timeshare, and the pension. Those, she said, would remain with Wallace. Faye had asked why. Patricia Dunn had smiled the small professional smile and said, "Because Mr. Holcombe earned them, Mrs. Holcombe." Faye had not bothered to argue. She had hired a younger attorney named Ben Castile, who worked out of a small office above the hardware store on Howard Street, and who had, more than once during their meetings, looked at her with the quiet sorrow of a man who knew he was outgunned. Ben had done his best. He had filed the counterclaims, requested the discovery, asked for the joint account histories. The histories had come back, neat and tidy, showing nothing unusual. Wallace had managed those accounts since 1987. Wallace had filed the taxes. Wallace had drawn up the household budget every January in a leather portfolio he kept in his study. Faye had signed where Wallace had told her to sign for 39 years, because that was how the marriage had been built, and because she had been busy walking a different kind of paperwork along the fire trails of the Pisgah. The morning the gavel came down, Faye had worn her best blouse, the cream-colored one with the small mother-of-pearl buttons that Marlene had given her for her 65th birthday. Wallace had worn a charcoal suit and the heavy gold wedding ring he had not yet bothered to remove. The judge had read the settlement aloud in a voice that sounded like a man reading a grocery list. Faye had not cried. She had stood in her cream blouse and her good dark trousers, and she had thought about a fire she had walked out of in 1979 on a ridge above Linville Gorge, when Cass Tweed had taught her how to read a wind shift by the way the laurel leaves turned. The judge had banged the gavel. Wallace had walked out of the courtroom without looking at her, his polished brown loafers tapping softly on the marble floor. She had driven home in her old Forest Service truck, the green Ford F250, with the white door panels and the bed that still smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and she had pulled into the gravel driveway of the small one-bedroom rental at the edge of Boone where she had been living for the last 7 months of the proceedings. She had carried in her one box from the trunk and set it on the kitchen table. She had made a pot of coffee. She had sat down, and she had reached finally for the box she had not opened in 4 years. The cardboard box marked in blue ballpoint with the single word Cass, the box she had carried out of the house on Faulkner Lane the day she filed her response to Wallace's petition, because some part of her had known, even then, that Cass's papers were the one inheritance Wallace's attorneys would never find on a balance sheet. Inside the box, beneath a folded Forest Service uniform jacket from 1986 and a stack of old topographic maps, she had found the brass key. It was tarnished green gold, threaded onto a worn leather Forest Service lanyard, and beneath it lay a single sheet of cream paper folded twice. The paper was a hand-drawn map of rich mountain. The contour lines were in Cass's careful ranger's print. The summit was marked with a single neat X, and taped to the back of the map was the note, "When you need it, see." Faye had held the key in her palm for a long time. The kitchen had grown dark around her. Outside, somewhere down the road, a dog was barking, and the October wind was moving through the oak leaves on the gravel. She had thought about Cass, about the way he had stood at the trailhead on her first day in the district in 1973, a tall, thin man in a faded green jacket who had looked at her with neither welcome nor hostility, but only the patient assessment of a fire ranger reading the weather, and had said, "You'll do, Holcombe. Go get your boots." She had thought about the heart attack on the trail 4 years ago, the one that had taken him quickly and quietly, the way a good ranger goes, with his boots on and the wind in the pines. She had not been able to attend the small service. Wallace had said the drive was too long. The phone rang at 7 the next morning. Faye, who had slept badly, picked it up on the third ring. It was Patricia Dunn. Patricia Dunn explained, in the soft professional voice, that there was one final piece of paperwork, a waiver, a release on any residual claim to inherited property Faye may have received during the marriage. A clean break, Patricia said. A formality. She would have it couriered over by noon. Faye, holding the brass key in her left hand and the phone in her right, had said only that she would think about it. Patricia Dunn had said, in a voice that was no longer quite as soft, that there was nothing to think about. Faye had said good morning and hung up. She had unfolded Cass's hand-drawn map on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with the side of her weathered hand, and she had looked at the X on the summit of Rich Mountain for a long, long time. And then she had reached for the phone and called Marlene Greer. Marlene arrived at 9:30 in the battered old Subaru Forester, the one with the faded extension agent decal still on the back window, and a thermos of black coffee on the passenger seat. Marlene Greer was 72, wiry and small, with cropped white hair and the same wire-rimmed glasses she had worn since 1992, and she had been Faye's best friend since the autumn of 1974, when they had met at a Farm Bureau soil conservation meeting in Newland and discovered that they were the only two women in a room of 40 men, and that they both took their coffee black and their opinions plainly. Marlene came up the walk, carrying her sketch pad under one arm and the thermos under the other, and she looked at Faye and said, "Well, show me." Faye showed her the brass key. Faye showed her the map. Marlene set the thermos down, and she pulled out the wire-rim reading glasses, and she studied the contour lines for a long minute, tracing the X with the tip of her short finger, and then she looked up and said, "Rich Mountain, that's Cass's place. He took me up there once, back in '88, just to the trailhead. Said he was working on something. Wouldn't say what." Faye said, "Library." Marlene said, "Library." By 11, they were sitting at the long oak table in the local history room of the Watauga County Library, surrounded by the slow, patient hush of old paper and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. And the librarian, a kind, soft-spoken woman named Doris, had brought them 3 cardboard archive boxes labeled NC Forest Service /Watauga/Fire Watchtowers /1932 to 1998. They had opened the boxes one by one. They had read the construction documents and the decommissioning reports and the maintenance logs. They had found the structural engineering survey from 1987 that had decommissioned the Rich Mountain Tower as structurally questionable, but had stopped short of a condemnation order. They had found the deed transfer from 1972, when a logging family named Mortensen had sold 80 acres of Rich Mountain to a Caswell J. Tweed for the recorded price of $11,000. They had found a small black and white photograph, paper clipped to the deed, showing a younger Cass standing at the base of the Watchtower in a Forest Service uniform, with the wind in his hair and the long Appalachian ridge fallen away behind him. Marlene, who had been quiet for a long time, set the photograph down and said, "That man loved that mountain." Faye said, "Yes." Marlene said, "And he left it to you." Faye did not answer. They walked out of the library at 1 in the afternoon and crossed King Street to the Boone Diner for a sandwich. The diner was crowded with the lunch rush, full of the warm smell of grilled cheese and coffee and the soft clatter of plates, and they took a booth in the back near the window. Faye had ordered a tomato soup. Marlene had ordered the chicken salad, and it was just as the waitress brought the coffee that Faye looked up and saw Wallace. He was sitting 2 booths away, his back half turned, in a quilted Barber jacket she had bought him for Christmas in 2014. Across from him sat Patricia Dunn in her navy suit, and beside Patricia, in a soft cashmere sweater the pale blue of an October sky, sat a woman Faye had never seen before, a woman perhaps 50, with sleek blonde hair and a small, careful smile, and a hand resting lightly on Wallace's forearm. Wallace was laughing softly. He was telling some story. The blonde woman was nodding. Patricia Dunn was making notes in a leather folio. Faye sat very still, Marlene followed her gaze, and for one long second Marlene's eyes went hard. Then Marlene reached across the table and put her hand over Faye's and said very quietly, "Eat your soup, honey. We're going up that mountain in the morning." Faye ate her soup. They paid the bill. They walked out past Wallace's booth, and Wallace did not look up, and Faye did not turn her head, and the bell above the diner door rang softly as they stepped out into the cold autumn afternoon. In the truck, on the way home, neither of them spoke for a long time, and then Marlene said, "Caroline, I'd guess. The blonde. Patricia Dunn's been seen with her at the country club." Faye said, "I don't need to know her name." Marlene said, "Fair enough." Back at the rental, Faye opened the box of Cass's papers again and began, slowly, to lay out its contents on the kitchen table. The Forest Service uniform jacket, the folded topographic maps, the notebooks of fire incident reports from the 1970s and 1980s, and at the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, a leather-bound journal she had not seen before. The leather a deep oxblood, the spine cracked with use, the cover stained faintly with what might have been pine resin or rain. She lifted it out. She opened the front cover. The first page bore Cass's careful inscription, "Caswell J. Tweed, Field Journal, Rich Mountain, begun April 1973. She held the open book to her face and breathed in. The cedar and pine smell of 40 years of wood smoke and rain and tower air rose off the pages, and Faye Holcombe, who had not cried at the gavel, and had not cried at the diner, and had not cried in the 18 months of Patricia Dunn's calm professional voice, sat down at the kitchen table and wept. She wept for Cass, and she wept for the long, quiet years of his solitary work, and she wept for the young woman she had been in 1973, the first woman ranger in her district, the one Cass had looked at and said simply, "You'll do." She wept for the marriage she had carried like a packed pack uphill for 39 years, while Wallace sat in his study with his leather portfolio. And then she dried her face on the cuff of her flannel shirt, and she made another pot of coffee, and she sat down to read. She read until midnight. Marlene slept on the couch. The journal was, in its way, the long, quiet autobiography of a forest, the slow record of one ranger's 30-year attention to a single mountain. Cass had walked Rich Mountain in every season for 3 decades. He had measured trees. He had photographed rock outcroppings. He had recorded the return of the pileated woodpecker and the slow recovery of the chestnut oak canopy and the migration patterns of the black bears that denned in the rhododendron thickets. He had mentioned Faye in many entries, never by name, only by the shorthand he had used for her since 1973. The girl ranger, and later, more tenderly, the Holcombe woman. He had written of her marriage with the brief, weary disapproval of a man who had watched a good ranger be slowly walked away from her own forest. He had written, in 1992, "She married a man who calls her work dirt and smoke. I will keep what I am keeping for the time when she remembers." Faye closed the journal. She set it on the table beside the brass key, and she understood, with the slow, clean certainty of a wind shift on a fire ridge, that whatever was at the top of Rich Mountain had been kept for her, and that it was time to climb the stairs. In the morning, Marlene made coffee in the small kitchen, and Faye loaded the truck with a thermos and 2 flashlights and a small pack of tools and the brass key on its leather lanyard around her neck. And they drove west out of Boone on the old gravel Forest Service road that climbed up the eastern flank of Rich Mountain through the autumn gold canopy of oak and hickory and the sudden silver flash of beech leaves in the morning light. The road switched back twice. Mountain mist rose through the trees. They passed no other vehicles. At a small, unmarked pullout 3 miles up, Marlene stopped the Subaru, and Faye opened the passenger door and stepped out onto the pine needle floor of the forest. And for one long moment, she stood in the cold autumn silence and listened to the slow sound of wind moving through 80 acres of trees that no one had told her, until 2 days ago, were now hers. The trailhead was unmarked. The path wound up through the rhododendron understory along the spine of the ridge, the soft red-brown duff giving softly underfoot. And after about a quarter mile, they came around a bend where the canopy opened, and Faye stopped, and Marlene came up beside her. And there it was. The Watchtower rose 60 feet through the autumn gold leaves, a stilt-legged tower of weathered Douglas fir timbers and dark steel cables, the small 14-foot square cab at its top, with the cracked glass walls and the steeply pitched cedar shake-hip roof, 4 steel cable guy lines anchored in the bedrock, the half-collapsed ground-level supply hut crouching at the base in a nest of fallen oak leaves. Mist drifted between the legs of the tower. A single Carolina wren sang from somewhere in the rhododendron. Faye felt her breath go out of her. She climbed the stairs slowly. The Douglas fir treads were weathered silver but solid underfoot. Marlene followed 5 steps behind, breathing carefully, one hand on the railing. The stairs spiraled up the central trunk of the tower in 3 long flights and 2 switchbacks, and at each landing Faye paused and looked out through the trees at the long blue ridges of the Pisgah, fallen away to the west, and she felt the slow, steadying click of something old in her chest that she had not felt in many years. The quiet competence of a ranger climbing toward the work that was hers. At the top landing, she stood before the cab door. The door was timber and glass, the upper panel boarded with weathered plywood. The lock was a heavy iron padlock on a steel hasp. Faye lifted the brass key from around her neck. She slid it into the padlock. The lock turned, slow and clean, on oiled tumblers that someone had been keeping oiled for many years. The hasp opened. Faye pushed the door inward. The cab was cleaner than expected. The 4 glass walls, 2 of them cracked and patched with carefully cut squares of plywood, let in the soft autumn light from all 4 directions. A small black wood-burning stove sat in one corner with a neat iron flue rising through the roof. A folding cot stood made up against the south wall under a folded wool blanket, and the entire north wall was hung with a stunning library of Forest Service maps, layered 3 and 4 deep, dating from 1932 through the 1990s, each one carefully tacked and labeled in Cass's hand. In the center of the cab, beneath the small copper-shaded lamp that hung from the rafter, stood a handsome rosewood writing desk, and on the desk, open to a page dated 3 weeks before Cass died, lay a leather-bound journal, twin to the one Faye had read the night before. Beside it sat a tin of pencils and a small frame photograph of a young Cass, and an even younger Faye standing at a fire trail in 1974, both of them in green Forest Service jackets, both of them squinting into the same morning sun. Faye walked slowly to the desk. Marlene came in behind her and stood very quietly near the door, one hand pressed to her mouth. Faye looked down at the open page of the journal. The handwriting was Cass's. The date at the top read 3 weeks before the date she knew by heart, and the last entry, written in the careful, slow ranger's hand of a man who had finished his work, read, 80 acres surveyed and ready. Faye will know where to look when she climbs the stairs. Faye sat down in the rosewood chair. She did not speak for a long time. The wind moved the cedar shakes overhead. Somewhere far below, in the slope of old hardwood, a raven called once, twice, and then was silent. And then Faye Holcombe, retired ranger, did what 40 years on the fire trails had taught her to do when the work in front of her was very large. She opened the desk drawer. She took out a fresh notebook. She uncapped a pencil, and she began. She cataloged the cab the way she would have cataloged a fire incident site. She walked the perimeter first, touching nothing, only looking. She noted the 4 glass walls, cracked panels east and south, intact north and west. She noted the wood-burning stove and its careful clean flue, the neat box of split hickory beside it, the small iron poker on its hook. She noted the folding cot and the wool blanket, both clean, both recently aired. She noted the rosewood desk and its 3 drawers, the small copper lamp wired to a deep-cycle marine battery in the corner, the rolled-up rug beneath the cot that turned out, when she lifted one corner, to be a finely woven Cherokee oak split mat. She made a careful inventory list in her notebook. Then she began on the maps. The maps numbered by her count, 147. She took them down one wall at a time, laid them flat on the desk and the cot and the floor, and she cataloged each one: date, scale, geographic extent, condition, annotations. The earliest map was a hand-inked U.S. Geological Survey sheet from 1932, the year the Watchtower itself had been built, and it showed the entire eastern flank of Rich Mountain in faint pencil corrections that someone had made in the 1940s. The latest was a 1996 Forest Service forest cover map, on which Cass had carefully shaded 80 acres of contiguous mature hardwood in pale green ink and written in the margin, chestnut oak, uncut, measured 1972, 1982, 1992. Faye felt her breath catch. She kept working. Marlene, who had been catalog trained at the extension office, took on the photographs. There were 3 large photo albums on a small shelf under the maps, and she carried them to the cot and began to work through them slowly, page by page, calling out dates and identifications in her quiet, steady voice while Faye made notes. Many of the photographs were trees, single great chestnut oaks and hickories photographed at 5-year intervals from the same compass bearing, so that when Marlene laid the matching photographs side by side on the cot, the slow growth of a single tree across 40 years rose up off the page like a small private kindness. Other photographs were people, old loggers, retired rangers, the long quiet faces of the men and women who had lived on this mountain. Cass had labeled each one in his careful hand on the back. By mid-afternoon, the cab was full of carefully laid out documents, and the long autumn light was slanting through the west glass, and Faye had filled 14 pages of her notebook. She stopped. She straightened slowly. Her lower back ached. She walked to the west window and stood looking out at the long, blue, rolling ridges of the Pisgah, and she said quietly, "I need Dawit." Marlene looked up from a photograph of a 1958 fire crew. "Who?" Faye said, "Dawit Haley, Cass's old supervisor. 30 years. He'll know what we're looking at." Marlene said, "Call him." Faye climbed back down the stairs slowly in the slanting afternoon light, walked the quarter-mile trail to the truck, and from the truck radio, the old Forest Service unit she had never taken out of the cab, she raised the Watauga County dispatcher and asked her to patch a phone call through to a retired number. The dispatcher, a young man named Tyler, recognized her voice at once. "Hello, Ranger Holcombe," he said. The phone patch came through to a small house on the south side of Boone, where Dawit Haley had been retired for 6 years, and Dawit, when he heard her voice, said only, "Faye, where are you?" Faye said, "Rich Mountain, the tower. Cass left it to me." There was a long silence. Then Dawit said, "I'll be there in the morning." He arrived at 8, in a clean gray Forester of his own, with a leather portfolio under his arm. Dawit Haley was 64, slim and upright, dark, close-cropped hair gone silver at the temples, soft brown eyes, and the slow, careful courtesy of a man who had spent his career listening more than he spoke. He had been born in Asmara and raised in Greensboro, and had walked into the North Carolina Forest Service in 1981 with a degree in forestry and a quiet determination that had taken him over 30 years to area supervisor of the Western District. He had been Cass's direct supervisor for the last 12 years of Cass's career. He climbed the stairs steadily, paused at the top to look out at the Blue Ridges, and stepped into the cab. He stood very quietly for a long minute. Then he said, "Cass kept telling me about a project. He never said where." He set the leather portfolio on the rosewood desk. He sat down in the chair Faye offered him, and he began, slowly, to read through Cass's open journal. After a long time, he looked up and said, "Faye, you need to call Imani Tarver." Faye said, "Who is that?" Dawit said, "Land acquisition specialist out of the Asheville office. Old growth easements." Cass had been talking to someone in Raleigh for 3 years about something on this mountain, but he wouldn't tell me what. If anyone in the department knows, it's Imani. I'll call her now. Imani Tarver drove up from Asheville the following afternoon. She was 36, tall, with locks pulled back in a dark blue silk wrap, an olive field jacket over a plaid shirt, sturdy brown boots, and the quick, precise eyes of a woman who had spent the last 12 years of her career walking old-growth forests with a measuring tape and a clipboard. She climbed the stairs in 11 minutes, paused at the cab door, looked at the wall of maps, looked at Faye and said, "Mrs. Holcombe, Mr. Tweed wrote to my office in 2021 about an 80-acre stand on Rich Mountain. He never sent us the survey. We have been wondering for 3 years where the survey went." Faye gestured at the wall of maps. "Welcome to the survey," she said. Imani laughed once, soft and astonished, and stepped inside. The 4 of them, Faye, Marlene, Dawit, Imani, worked through the cab for the rest of that afternoon and well into the evening. Imani identified, in the wall of maps, the careful tree-by-tree inventory Cass had drawn up between 1972 and 1996. She identified the carbon dating notation in the margins. She identified, quietly, the nature of what Cass had been keeping. Old-growth chestnut oak forest of this contiguity, she said, was almost gone in western North Carolina. Most stands had been cut between 1880 and 1930 to find 78 contiguous acres of mature, uncut chestnut oak with hickory and hemlock interplanting was rarer than rare. It was, she said quietly, the kind of stand that conservation biologists wrote papers about. It was Faye, late that afternoon, who found the trap door. She had gone down the stairs to retrieve a fresh thermos of coffee from the truck, and on her way back up, she had stopped at the base of the tower to look at the half-collapsed supply hut. The hut was a small 10 by 12 structure of weathered board and batten siding, the roof partially fallen in on the south side, the door hanging on one hinge. She had pushed the door open with the toe of her boot and stepped inside. The floor was a litter of oak leaves and pine duff and the soft brown remnants of an old wool blanket. She had begun, idly, to brush the leaves aside with the side of her boot, and her boot had struck something hard and metallic. She had bent down. She had brushed the leaves away with her hand. It was an iron ring, set flush into a small square of dark heart pine planking, a trapdoor. Faye had stared at it a long moment. She had straightened up slowly, and it was just then, through the open doorway of the hut, that she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel pullout 300 yards down the trail. She stepped out of the hut and walked a few paces up the path until she could see down through the trees. A polished black F-150 was rolling slowly onto the gravel pad of the trailhead. The driver's door opened. Wallace Holcombe stepped out, Marlene had heard the tires, too, from the cab landing, and she came down the stairs fast for a woman her age, the wire-rimmed glasses pushed up onto her white hair and a hard set to her small mouth. She passed Faye on the trail and said, "Stay up there, I've got him." Faye said, "Marlene." Marlene said, "I have got him, Faye. Go open whatever is under that door." And she walked on down the trail toward the trailhead, the gravel crunching softly under her boots, while Faye stood for one long second in the cold afternoon light and then turned and climbed back up to fetch Imani. Marlene reached the trailhead just as Wallace was zipping up the barber jacket against the mountain cold. He was alone. The truck still ticked from the climb. He looked up and saw her, and his expression flickered for just a moment with surprise, and then with the polished social smile he used at country clubs. "Marlene," he said, "I was hoping to see Faye." Marlene stopped 10 feet from him, hands in the pockets of her old fleece, and said, "Wallace, this is private property. You're trespassing." Wallace's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Private property of my ex-wife," he said, "regarding which I have a few legal questions. I'd like to see what's up there. Patricia thinks there may be some clarifications needed about residual claims." Marlene said, "Patricia can put her clarifications in writing and mail them to Faye's attorney. You are not going up that trail." Wallace took half a step forward. Marlene did not move. "Marlene," Wallace said, the smile dropping now, "I am not going to be lectured by a retired extension agent in the middle of the woods. I have a right to verify what my ex-wife has acquired." Marlene said, "You have a right to nothing on this mountain, Wallace. The judge signed the decree. The property predates the marriage by 13 years. You are welcome to call your attorney. You're not welcome up that trail." Wallace's narrow gray-blue eyes narrowed further. "I'll call the sheriff," he said. Marlene said, "Please do." Behind her, on the trail, came the sound of careful boots on duff. Dawit Haley, who had heard the voices and had come down quietly, stepped out of the rhododendron and stood beside Marlene. He did not say anything at first. He simply looked at Wallace with the slow, patient courtesy he had used in 30 years of Forest Service negotiations. Then he said, "Mr. Holcombe, I am Dawit Haley, retired NC Forest Service Area Supervisor. The property you are standing at the foot of is private and recorded. You are being asked politely to leave." Wallace looked from Marlene to Dawit and back. He said, "Who are you to ask me anything?" Dawit said, "A friend of the owner. Also, I have called Deputy Calvin Boyd, who is on his way up from the Cove Creek station. Deputy Boyd worked fire detail with me for 11 years. He will be here in approximately 7 minutes." Wallace stared. Dawit added very softly, "I would suggest you not still be here when he arrives." For one long moment, Wallace did not move. The wind moved through the oak leaves overhead. A jay called somewhere down the slope. And then Wallace Holcombe turned, jerked open the door of the polished black F-150, climbed in, slammed it, started the engine, and reversed slowly down the gravel pad and back onto the Forest Service road. The truck disappeared around the first switchback. Dawit waited a long minute listening, and then he turned to Marlene and said, "I'll wait here for Calvin. Go on up." Marlene squeezed his arm once and walked back up the trail. In the supply hut, Faye and Imani had pulled the iron ring. The trap door had lifted easily on cleaned hinges. Beneath it lay a short wooden ladder leading down into a dry, stone-walled root cellar, perhaps 8 feet by 10. The walls dressed mountain stone laid by hand decades ago. The floor, a smooth bed of crushed quartz. A small kerosene lantern hung on a peg at the bottom of the ladder. Imani lit it with a wooden match. The cellar filled with a soft, warm yellow light. The cellar was full of Cass's archive. 3 long oak shelves ran along the east wall, stacked with archival boxes labeled in Cass's hand. Rich Mountain, Tree Inventory, 1972 to 82. Rich Mountain, Tree Inventory, 1982 to 92. Fire Incidents, Pisgah, 1955 to 1975. Logging Family Histories, Mortensen, Bradshaw Coffee, and a dozen more. The west wall held a long, flat file cabinet of large format hand-drawn topographic maps, the kind a draftsman made with a quill and a steady hand. The north wall held a glass-fronted bookcase of leather-bound journals, 30 of them, Cass's annual field journals from 1972 to 2021. And in the far corner, beside the shelves, sat a heavy black iron metal trunk with a small brass padlock, the kind sold at hardware stores in the 1970s. Imani knelt beside the trunk. Faye knelt beside her. Faye lifted the brass key from around her neck and tried it in the small brass padlock. The padlock opened on the first turn. Faye lifted the lid. Inside the trunk lay a folio of large, slightly yellowed papers tied with cotton cord. Imani lifted them carefully into the lantern light. They were the original 1932 Civilian Conservation Corps construction documents for the Rich Mountain Watchtower itself. Blueprints, specifications, lumber lists, the original cab plan, even a detailed structural analysis of the 4 steel cable guy lines. Beneath the blueprints lay a sheaf of black and white photographs of the men who had built the tower in 1932. 23 young men in canvas trousers and rolled-sleeve shirts, smiling tiredly at the camera with their saws and their adzes and their square-cut Douglas fir timbers, the scaffolding rising behind them through the mountain mist. And beneath the photographs lay a long, handwritten list in 3 different scripts across 3 different generations, titled Fire Rangers, Rich Mountain Tower, 1932 to 1987. Faye ran her finger down the list. 53 names. Cass's name was the last. Above his, in 1973, was an entry in what she recognized with a small, soft shock as Cass's hand, F. Holcombe, Relief Ranger, first season, promising. She had not known. In all those years, she had not known he had recorded her, even briefly, on the watch list. She set the list down very gently. Beneath the ranger's list, folded carefully in a manila folder marked deed, lay Cass's original 1972 deed to the 80 acres, surveyed, witnessed, recorded with the Watauga County Register. Imani spread it open in the lantern light. She read the survey description aloud, slowly, her voice rising at the second paragraph. "Faye," she said, "the 80 acres are not what your husband thought." She traced the boundary with her finger. "This isn't 2 acres of summit and 78 acres of cliff. This is a contiguous block of old-growth Appalachian hardwood extending 2,000 vertical feet down both sides of the ridge. This is a chestnut oak stand, Faye. This is one of the last untouched mature chestnut oak stands in western North Carolina." She looked up. The lantern made small, warm reflections in her dark eyes. "I can confirm it on the spot," she said, "and the state will want this on conservation easement faster than you can hike out of here." There was one more thing in the trunk. Folded inside the lid, taped lightly to the iron, lay a sealed cream envelope addressed in Cass's careful hand. "To Faye Holcombe, when she climbs the stairs." Faye lifted it down. Her hands were steady. She broke the seal. 3 documents lay inside the envelope. The first was a notarized affidavit, signed and witnessed 3 years before Cass's death, naming Faye Holcombe sole heir of the 80-acre Rich Mountain property and all improvements thereon. The second was a folded letter on the heavy cream stationery of the NC Department of Forestry. The conservation easement offer Imani had been chasing for 3 years, addressed to Caswell J. Tweed, offering $1,400,000 for a permanent old-growth conservation easement on 78 acres of the rich mountain stand, with the Watchtower and the surrounding 2 acres reserved to the owner for personal use in perpetuity. The third document was a thick 3-ring binder, soft black leatherette, bound in brass screws. Faye opened the binder. The first page was a careful index in Cass's hand. The pages that followed were forensic photocopies, bank statements, canceled checks, retirement account distribution forms, signature comparisons. The signature comparisons made Faye's breath go out of her. There, on the left side of each comparison sheet, was her own true signature, the one she had written on her ranger's logs for 40 years, the slow, careful F. Holcombe with the clean upstroke on the F. There, on the right side, was a signature that was almost, but not quite, the same. The F was a little too narrow. The H was a little too tall. And those signatures, dated across 8 years, appeared on retirement account distribution forms drawn against a personal pension supplement Faye had not known her husband had been touching. The total at the bottom of the index, in Cass's small, careful printing, read $290,400, confirmed transfers, F. Holcombe pension supplement, 8 years, signatures forged by W. Holcombe. Faye sat back on her heels in the lantern light. She did not speak for a long time. Imani very quietly closed the binder and set it on the trunk lid, and then Faye unfolded the last item in the envelope, a single handwritten letter on a half sheet of cream paper in Cass's hand, undated. Faye girl, if you have come up the stairs, the time has come and the man has shown you who he is. I have been keeping the cab for the woman who knew the difference between a forest and a portfolio. The 80 acres are yours. The chestnut oak stand is yours. The paperwork your husband signed for you, without your knowing, is here too. The stairs are easier going down than up, but you will not be going down. You will be going home. Cass. Faye read it once silently. Then she read it aloud, slowly, to Imani. Marlene came down the ladder halfway through, having walked back up from the trailhead, and stopped on the 3rd rung when she heard the words. Dowett came in after her, ducking through the low door of the hut, his ranger's hat in his hands. Faye finished the letter. The cellar was very quiet. Marlene was crying without sound, the wire-rimmed glasses sliding slightly on her nose. Dowett lifted his ranger's hat and laid it on the flat top of the trunk and said softly, "That was Cass." Imani, who had not known Cass, and who had only in the last hour come to understand the shape of his 3 decades of work, drew a long breath and said, "Mrs. Holcombe, this is the most intact, mature chestnut oak stand we have surveyed in 20 years. The easement offer stands. The department will move on it within the week. And the forgery binder is going to the State Bureau of Investigation by Monday morning." Faye nodded once. She folded the letter. She put the letter back in the envelope and the envelope back in the trunk and the binder under her arm. She climbed up the ladder out of the cellar and stood in the soft afternoon light of the open supply hut and looked up through the gap in the roof at the long underside of the Watchtower, rising 60 feet above her into the autumn gold canopy. She did not cry. She had cried the night before over the leather journal in her kitchen. Now there was work to do. Imani filed the easement paperwork that Friday from the Asheville office, and the following Monday morning, Dowett walked the leatherette binder of forensic photocopies up the granite steps of the SBI field office in Hickory and laid it on the desk of an investigator named Reyna Cordova, who had worked white-collar fraud cases for 12 years and who, according to Dowett, took her coffee black and her evidence in chronological order. The binder was perfect. Cass had built it the way he had built everything, slowly, methodically, with an eye on a season 20 years out. Reina Cordova read through it in a single afternoon and made 3 phone calls. By Friday of that week, the SBI had opened a formal investigation into Wallace Holcombe for systematic forgery of retirement account distribution forms across an 8-year period. The Watauga County Register of Deeds recorded the rich mountain property under Faye Holcombe's sole ownership the following Tuesday. Imani Tarver hand-walked the conservation easement contract through the Department of Forestry approval process in 9 business days, and at noon, on a clear, cold November Friday, Faye sat at the rosewood desk in the cab of the Watchtower and signed the easement on the original 1972 deed beside the newly recorded 2026 transfer. Imani countersigned. Dawit witnessed. Marlene, in the wire-rim glasses, notarized. The wood-burning stove was lit for the first time in Faye's tenancy, and the cab smelled of hickory smoke and cedar shake, and the long, slow paper smell of 50 years of map ink. The check from the Department of Forestry in the amount of $1,400,000 was direct deposited to Faye Holcombe's First National account on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The forgery investigation moved quickly. Reina Cordova interviewed 3 handwriting analysts and 4 bank records officers and the back office manager of the First Citizens branch, where Wallace had been processing the distributions. By the second week of December, the SBI had filed 17 counts of forgery and 1 count of elder financial exploitation against Wallace Holcombe. The investigation became public when the small front-page article appeared in the Watauga Democrat under the headline, "Local Retired Executive Indicted on Forgery Charges," with a careful 3-paragraph summary that did not name Faye but mentioned a wife of 39 years and a Forest Service pension supplement of approximately $290,000. The consequences for Wallace cascaded the way consequences do when a man has lived for 40 years on the assumption that no one was ever going to look. The Charlotte insurance firm, where he had been consulting since his retirement, Hadley, Becker, and Yarborough, held an internal review and quietly terminated his consulting contract within 72 hours of the indictment. The North Carolina Department of Insurance suspended his consultant's license pending the criminal investigation. His country club membership at Foxgrove Hills was placed under review by the membership committee, which had begun that autumn to take a renewed interest in the moral character of its retired members. The Charleston timeshare, which had been held by Wallace alone, was court-ordered for sale to satisfy the restitution order on the forged distributions. It sold in early February for slightly less than its assessed value to a young couple from Greenville who had been waiting for the price to drop. Caroline, the blonde woman from the diner, whose last name turned out to be Prentice, and who was, as Marlene had guessed, an acquaintance of Patricia Dunn's, read the small front-page article in the Watauga Democrat on a Saturday morning in early January and left Wallace within the month for a Charlotte plastic surgeon she had been quietly meeting for tennis on Tuesday afternoons. She did not leave a note. She left instead the cashmere sweater Wallace had bought her at Christmas, folded carefully on the kitchen counter of the Faulkner Lane house, with a single post-it note that read, "I am not built for this." C. Patricia Dunn quietly withdrew from representation in mid-February, citing professional considerations. Wallace hired a Charlotte criminal defense attorney, whose hourly rate exceeded Patricia's. The criminal defense attorney advised an early plea. Wallace, who had managed his marriage like a portfolio for 39 years, discovered perhaps for the first time what a portfolio looked like when it had been managed by someone who had not bothered to read the prospectus. Wallace's adult daughter, Bess, a high school history teacher in Asheville, whom Faye had not raised but had loved across the long years of Wallace's first marriage's aftermath, phoned Faye one cold Tuesday morning in late February. Bess was crying. She had read the article in the Watauga Democrat. She had not known. She said it again, several times, into the phone. "I did not know, Faye. I would have stopped him." Faye, sitting at the rosewood desk in the cab with the morning fog rising through the oak leaves below, listened with the quiet patience she had learned over 40 fire seasons, and at the end she said only, "Bess, honey, you are not your father. Come up the mountain in the spring, bring the kids." Bess wept harder for a moment, and then she laughed once, soft and astonished, and she said, "I will." In early March, on a Sunday morning of light fog and the first faint smell of spring in the rhododendron, Faye drove out to the small hillside cemetery on the east side of Boone, where Cass Tweed lay buried beneath a simple gray granite headstone bearing only his name and his dates and the brief inscription, "Ranger." She carried a small dried bundle of mountain rhododendron tied with a strip of blue cotton ribbon. She knelt at the foot of the stone. She laid the bundle gently against the granite. She did not speak for a long minute. The morning was very still. A single Carolina wren sang from somewhere in the cedars at the edge of the cemetery. Faye placed her weathered hand on the cold top of the stone. She said very quietly, "Thank you, Cass." She stood up slowly. She walked back to her truck. She drove home up the mountain. The Caswell Tweed Mountain Heritage Preserve was officially designated by the North Carolina Department of Forestry on the first day of May. The 78 acres of old-growth chestnut oak became permanently protected under conservation easement, with public access pedestrian trails surveyed and flagged through the eastern third of the preserve, and a permanent research access agreement granted to the forestry school at North Carolina State University. The Watchtower itself, restored under Faye's careful supervision over the spring, new cedar shakes on the hip roof, fresh glass in the 4 cab walls, the Douglas fir staircase reinforced under the guidance of a structural engineer out of Asheville named Henry Whitcomb, reopened to the public on the morning of June 1st as a free seasonal scenic overlook from May through October, with a small ground floor forest ranger museum installed in the rebuilt supply hut. The museum, curated jointly by Faye and DeWitt, displayed Cass's complete 30-year archive in a series of glass-fronted cases, the tree-by-tree photographs, the fire incident reports, the family histories of the loggers, the 1932 CCC construction documents, the long, quiet list of 53 rangers who had kept watch from the rich mountain cab. Faye moved her belongings into the cab full-time in the second week of June, sleeping on the folding cot under the wool blanket, cooking on the small wood-burning stove, carrying her water in a 5-gallon jug up the Douglas fir staircase 3 times a week. The state designated her, by a small ceremonial appointment, the live-in interpretive ranger of the Mountain Heritage Preserve. The salary was modest. The view was not. Faye founded the Caswell Tweed Forest Apprenticeship in late June, funded by a portion of the easement payment held in a small endowment at the Watauga County Community Foundation. The apprenticeship was a paid 2-year program, training young people of Watauga County and surrounding communities in forestry, fire science, and old-growth conservation, with classroom instruction at the Wilkes Community College Extension and field instruction on the Mountain Heritage Preserve. 5 apprentices were selected for the inaugural class from a pool of 41 applicants. One was a young Cherokee woman named Sequoia Locust, 21, from a community on the Qualla boundary, who had grown up walking her grandfather's deer hunting trails in the Smokies, and who, on the morning of her interview at the cab, had stood at the west window for a long, quiet minute and said, "My grandmother told me there used to be chestnut oak forests this big. I thought she was telling me a story." Marlene took on the visitor desk at the trailhead on weekends, opening at 9 on Saturday mornings with a thermos of coffee and a folder of brochures and the careful patience of 40 years of public extension work. DeWitt consulted on the museum exhibits and gave a free monthly lecture on Appalachian fire history in the small Rangers classroom at the trailhead, which filled, in the summer months, with hikers and retirees and the occasional school group. Imani brought forestry students up from the Asheville office twice a semester for field workshops on old-growth identification and conservation easement law. And the students, walking the long, quiet trails under the mature chestnut oak canopy, learned more in an afternoon than they had learned in a textbook semester. The preserve, in its first full year, hosted approximately 6,000 visitors, and the small donation box in the museum lobby quietly funded a second year of the apprenticeship. Bess Holcombe brought her children up the mountain on Memorial Day weekend, a thin, shy boy of 9 and a dark-eyed girl of 7 who climbed the stairs holding her grandmother's hand and stood at the west window of the cab and asked, in a soft, careful voice, whether the trees went on forever. Faye, looking down at the long, blue, rolling ridges of the Pisgah, said, "Far enough, honey, far enough." Bess stayed for 3 days. She didn't mention her father. She helped Faye sweep the cab and aired the wool blanket and learned the names of the 7 principal hardwood species on the eastern flank of the preserve. And on the morning she left, she hugged Faye for a long time at the trailhead and said, "Tell me when to come back." Wallace Holcombe entered an Alford plea in late summer, accepting a sentence of 2 years supervised probation, full restitution of the $290,400, surrender of his suspended insurance license, and 100 hours of community service to be completed at a financial literacy program for senior citizens in Charlotte. The Faulkner Lane house, leveraged against the restitution and the legal fees, was sold in October to a young surgeon and her husband. Wallace moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a quiet brick complex on the south side of Charlotte. He did not contest the deed. He did not attempt to climb the mountain again. The polished black F-150 was sold to satisfy the second installment of the restitution order. Faye received a single letter from him in November, 3 handwritten paragraphs on plain white paper, the handwriting smaller than she remembered, in which he wrote that he understood now, in some measure, what he had done. She read the letter once. She did not answer it. She placed it, folded, in a small cedar box, on the rosewood desk, beside the brass key. On Sunday mornings, in the long blue dawn fog that rolled up the eastern flank of Rich Mountain and pooled in the canopy like slow, cold milk, Faye climbed the Douglas fir staircase in her olive Filson jacket and her gray wool turtleneck, set her old Forest Service binoculars on the rosewood desk, opened Cass's leather field journal, the one he had begun in 1973, to a fresh blank page after the last of his entries, and wrote one quiet line in her own slow ranger's hand. The brass key on its Forest Service lanyard hung now on a fine leather cord around her neck, warm against her skin under the wool. Some mornings she wrote about the weather. Some mornings she wrote about the trees. Some mornings she wrote about sequoia locusts' slow, careful progress with the chainsaw, or the new pileated woodpecker she had heard the morning before in the hemlock above the supply hut, or the way the autumn light, beginning to turn again, came in through the west window of the cab and fell on the small frame photograph of a young Cass and an even younger Faye standing in their green Forest Service jackets in the morning sun of 1974. Some mornings she wrote only one word. Some mornings she wrote a paragraph. The journal filled slowly, the way Cass's 30 journals had filled before her, with the long, patient attention of one ranger to one mountain. The seasons passed in the cab. The first snows came in late November, the slow, soft mountain snows of the high Pisgah, and Faye lit the wood-burning stove and split her own hickory and made her own coffee and walked her own trails. Spring came in March, in the small green flush of mountain laurel and the slow, heavy honey smell of the chestnut oak in early bloom. Summer brought the apprentices, then the second year of apprentices, then the third. Dawit grew older. Marlene wore a slightly stronger pair of glasses. Imani was promoted to Regional Director of Land Acquisition for the entire Western District and continued to bring her students up the mountain, now in greater numbers, along the well-worn switchback trail that the apprentices had carefully blazed and reblazed in the slow, patient discipline of those who keep what they are given. On a clear, cold morning in late October of Faye's third autumn in the cab, she stood at the west window with a fresh cup of coffee in her hand and watched the morning fog burn slowly off the long blue ridges of the Pisgah, and she thought, as she sometimes did, of the cream-colored blouse she had worn to the courthouse the day the gavel had come down, and of the brass key in the bottom of the box marked Cass in blue ballpoint, and of the long, quiet sound of Marlene's voice on the phone on a morning when Faye Holcombe had not yet known that anywhere in the world was still hers to walk into. And she thought, with the slow, clean certainty of a wind shift on a fire ridge, that an old ranger had been right about her in 1973, and that an old ranger had been right about her in 1992, and that an old ranger had been right about her in the last entry of his last field journal, 3 weeks before he had walked his last trail. She lifted the coffee. She drank. She set the cup down on the rosewood desk. She picked up the pencil. She wrote one quiet line. Thank you for climbing every step of Faye's journey. From the cold arithmetic of a Watauga County divorce, to the warm dawn fog rolling through the cab of a Watchtower her old mentor had been keeping for her since 1972. If Faye's story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been left by a husband after a lifetime, if you've ever walked out of a courthouse with a single brass key and a Forest Service pension, if you've discovered that the people who taught you what mattered had been keeping a place for you on a mountaintop, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realize that an old mentor builds a home only the right woman is ever meant to climb the stairs to. Because Faye's story proves that quiet rangers leave inheritances only the right woman is ever meant to find, that 39 years of marriage cannot erase what an old mentor saw in her in 1972, and that a brass key on a Forest Service lanyard outweighs every retirement account distribution Wallace Holcombe ever forged. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like a worthless rock pile at the top of a mountain road can hold an inheritance no insurance executive ever counted, because the old ranger kept the cab clean for the woman he believed in. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.